Hello and welcome to the WION Global Summit. This is our second Global Summit and this is the US edition. We are doing it in collaboration with the Deepak and Neera Raj Center on Indian Economic Policies, as you all know, at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. How do you think India then is poised at the moment? Because there's so much talk about a slowdown.
Global economy is a very large economy and there have been ups and downs in the past. But the countries that chose the right policies continue to grow. So take, for example, China. When China, let's say 20 years ago, the global export market, only in merchandise, I'm not even counting services, was about between $6 and $7 trillion. Today it's 17 trillion. Much bigger today. So should I be pessimistic? No. Not only that, but during this period, if you recall, we also had this big financial crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008 when the Lehman Brothers fell. And through that, China continued to grow at about 10% a year. So therefore, it is true, you're right, that tensions are a bit high today. But we also had these boots of protectionism in the past. I mean, I'm old enough actually even to remember the times, the 1980s, America was going after Japan, right? That after oil crisis, the small cars were coming in very large numbers from Japan, and the United States car industry couldn't compete, and so they really went after Japan at the time. And, there was a term used in those days called Japan bashing was going on. So, we are seeing that probably on a larger scale this time against China. But, these are things with which countries can deal if they have good policies internally themselves.
If they have good policies is a leading question then. How do you see India's policies and economic situation, and are we equipped to deal with the slowdown?
So I think we have done quite well in the last, I would say, 20 years or so. If I take even a long period of about 15 years, we have grown about 7.7%. In the last 5 years, we have grown 7.5% under Prime Minister Modi. But also, I think a lot of the reforms are accumulating. So, we already had a set of reforms under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, then under Prime Minister Vajpayee, now under Prime Minister Modi. And at least 2 or 3 very big reforms happened under Prime Minister Modi in the first term. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act, the GST, the Aadhaar, the whole digital platform and related to that, the direct benefit transfers. So those things happened. But even within the short period in the second term, and I think now the government is moving much faster. We don't see it yet, or most people who are not paying enough attention are not seeing it. But the truth of the matter is that within this short period, 2 big reforms on the economic side. I mean, there's other stuff going on in political side, but on the economic side alone, 2 very big reforms. One is the National Medical Commission, NMC Act, which replaces the archaic Indian Medical Council Act. So that's a big reform, and I particularly notice it because, I was very deeply involved with it in the actual writing of the new act, which has now been passed in both the houses, big one. And the other one is what we saw just within the last few days, which is the knocking down of the corporate profit tax for all companies, domestic companies, that is to 22%, which with other surcharges, etc., will be 25%. And for the new investment, it is down to 15% plus 2, which is 17. So that is a huge, particularly if you're trying to bring in foreign companies, the foreign multinationals to our shores, which are leaving now the Chinese shores. I think that's a huge impetus, huge incentive.
Indeed. So is this current situation then, this slowdown, cyclical, or are there fundamental issues that are leading to this?
There's probably a little bit of both. The cyclical one, of course, we know that things like auto industry, for example, there was a slowdown in 13-14, slowdown in 9-10. So there is cyclical element, and now currently the current slowdown for auto is much bigger, of course. But there are also structural factors at work here. And one of the big ones I would say is that, the prime ministers fight against corruption. You see, we don't realize, but the rules under which now business is being done have changed. And a lot of the companies are still adjusting to that. Take a real estate industry, for instance. Easily 50 to 60% of the transaction in real estate industry used to happen in cash. Today, most of it is happening in either check or some sort of digital format. You can't make payments under the table anymore on real estate. So there's a big change, and that's a type of change that is actually happening all around. So that's one structural problem. The other structural problem is the bank NPAs. So non-performing assets are being now addressed, and in that process, what is now happening is that for the companies, in the past, people were able to get loans based on their connections and so forth. That's not happening anymore. And on the bank side, banks now recognize that if they make bad loans, they will have to bite the bullet. The rules of the Reserve Bank of India has been considerably tightened, and so the banks, as a result, are doing much greater scrutiny in assessing the loans. So for both of those reasons, there's a lot of restructuring and readjusting that's going on. So that's the kind of the other part which you said, the structural or long term.
Two things have happened recently. One, earlier this month, the US-India Business Council said that there's an opportunity for India given the global economic situation. How does India exploit that opportunity and unleash its potential? And two, there is so much talk about a $5 trillion economy, which is a rather ambitious target that the government seems to have set itself given the global economic environment. Are we on course to achieving that, first of all, and exploiting those opportunities? And B, how does it affect or help the common person, the common man in India?
Okay, there's lots of questions there. Let me see if I can keep track. So it is currently we do have a big opportunity, particularly because for two reasons. Rising wages, which are already about 3 times in China than in India. So that gives India a big advantage over the Chinese wages. And of course, the trade war, which limits the access of the companies that are trying to export products from China to the United States. So many companies are trying to move out of China. So it does give us a big opportunity. And I think it is time that we really take advantage of it. The cut in the corporate profit tax is a big boost. I think that will help. But we'll need to do more on labor laws, on Land Acquisition Act, etc. Your second question on $5 trillion economy, Prime Minister is ambitious. And so, of course, he always sets ambitious targets. But, I think it's achievable. And even if we don't exactly hit 5 billion, we'll come close. If you look at our experience in the last 15 years, in nominal dollars, we have grown easily between about 12 to 13% a year. So if we do that again in the next 5-6 years, I think we get there. But it will take a little bit of work. And as far as the common man is concerned, of course, how that benefits the common man, big time. In fact, if you look back at our own history, so when you say 5 trillion, we are saying growth. And if we look back at our history, the reason common man or common woman really did not benefit much or didn't see much improvement in her lot for decades actually after the independence, it was because we really couldn't generate the kind of growth we needed. So per capita incomes, grew at something like 1.5% between 1950 to 1980. That's too slow. And we started also at a very low level of per capita income to begin with. So therefore, you start at a low level and grow very little, you don't see much improvement. Today we got a good base also in the economy. And also, then when we started growing, particularly, if you look at between 2000 and till today, last 2 decades, massive reduction in poverty, massive increases in income, and that reduction in poverty is not, for one group or another group. It's across the board. You can look at the entire population, you can look at the scheduled castes, you can look at the scheduled tribes, you can look at Hindus, you can look at Muslims, you can look at OBCs, every single group actually, and I've done this analysis, and so it's a matter of not speculation, but very hard numbers. You see decline in poverty across every single group. So growth ultimately is what gets you there, and for good reason. When growth happens, wages rise, so that empowers the people directly. They can access education better, they can access health care better, so they themselves get empowered. But in addition, even the government gets empowered because government gets more revenues, and these revenues can then be used to undertake more social programs. So, when revenues started multiplying, we saw that the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme could be started. Food Security Act could be extended to 75% of the population. That's only because growth delivered these revenues.
India is a young country, and India can provide a global workforce. But the challenge has been to find a way to unlock this potential of the youth. So do you believe that then the job solution will come from changing the educational policies and pushing in for more? Because we did try that. Skill development was something that didn't quite take off the way it was expected to.
Yeah, so even on skills, my take really is that primarily it ought to be done by the industry, because industry knows what kind of workers they need. The government can do a little bit, but not in vast volumes, right? Because, for example, 3 years ago or 2 years ago, I was in India and we were all talking about skilling workers in auto industry. Now the auto industry really is in a bad shape, right? And it's laying off workers rather than hiring. So it is better to let the industry do the bulk of the training, skill formation and so forth. But what India needs to do is provide good laws. For example, labor markets in India are incredibly inflexible. And that is, I think, one of the primary reasons why in sectors where a lot of workers should be employed, can be employed, we don't do well. It's a sort of paradox of India that capital is the scarce factor. And you see all the entrepreneurs complaining that, the real interest rates are so high and so forth. But then where do they go and invest? In the most highly capital intensive sectors. I mean, if capital is scarce, go to something like apparel, footwear, where for small amount of capital you use a lot of labor, which is a cheaper factor, and mass produce. But somehow they, so we also need a bit of training of our own entrepreneurs, who are very much kind of concentrated and confined to these very highly capital intensive sectors. They need to understand that, there's a country whose big strength is workforce.
Right. How can the Indian diaspora help in realizing this $5 trillion dream?
This is a question I get asked a lot. And my answer is going to be a bit of a non-answer. Because I think the diaspora know themselves. Each of us knows ourselves the best. You can't know what my strengths are. I can't know what your strengths are. But each of us knows what our strengths are. And we have to really act according to our strengths. So when I went to work in India, I didn't ask anybody, how can I help? It's just, I try to exploit my strengths. And I think this is how we have to approach this. Once, the commitment is there and the diaspora really want to do it, there's plenty of opportunity actually, but go and exploit your strength and go and do things that you do the best and that you want to do. Don't do it for the country. My take is, if we all do the best, that we do the best, I think India will also do the best.
That's a very interesting take. The trade war between the US and China, while most agree that it is not going to help anyone, it makes everybody bleed. Some have also said that this is an opportunity in wolf's clothing for India, and India can
Well,
fill the gaps.
I was probably one of the very early ones. And even while I was at Niti Aayog, actually, I was trying to push on that frontier. Because, you see, China has a 12% share in the global export market. And a lot of these exports come to the United States. So, that's one factor. But there's also the second factor going on, which is that the Chinese wages have gone up. Today, Chinese wages are easily about 3 times the wages of India on average. So, there's going to be there's a big shift underway of the production structure, location of production. Right now, in most of the news that you see, largely this movement is happening to Vietnam and to Bangladesh and all. But none of them have got the kind of large workforce that is ultimately required to replace China as the manufacturing factory of the world. Only India has that kind of workforce. What we are still lacking is a fast enough movement on economic policies. If India moves fast enough on economic policy reforms, and I mentioned labor, but also Land Acquisition Act, I think that has to be fixed also, because after all, large factories require large spaces. And in India, where all kinds of encumbrances exist on this plot or that plot of land, it's very difficult for a private person to go in and acquire or purchase purely, 100 acres of land or 200 acres of land. The government has to step in, at least with some of the pockets. Even here in the United States, Columbia University was purchasing a lot of land here in Manhattanville. And in one or two places, actually, the president of Columbia invoked the eminent domain. He had to, there's no other way to do it. And Columbia being a public institution, was able to do it. Land acquisition is another very big issue which needs to be addressed. Now, the Prime Minister, to his credit, had tried it in his first term. But in the end, he couldn't carry the legislation through the Rajya Sabha, the upper house. But today, now he has votes, I think, in both the houses. He can do it.
He can do it. And he has been very bullish on reform. And he said in the speech in Houston that we do not believe in incremental change anymore. We're looking at comprehensive change. But coming back to the trade war and the adverse tariffs that America seems to be slapping on pretty much everyone, do you think that this is hurting the global economy as a whole?
I think it is hurting the global economy. It is hurting the United States economy. It is hurting the Chinese economy. So one has to acknowledge that. The real issue really here is that, at least in the United States, I see general sort of agreement on, that's one issue on which the Democrats sort of seem to hold at least, a different view than that of the president. So on that front, I'm not very optimistic that, even if we have a change of government here and a Democratic president comes into White House, whether he would be able to or she would be able to, in a big way, kind of roll this back. There has been a sense here that that China has not played by the rules of the game, and therefore something needs to be done. But the problem, of course, also is that in a trade war, it is a bit of a dead end. I started writing it almost 1.5 to 2 years ago, that China is also an aggressive and belligerent power. So it's not that, it will simply, back off. It would challenge the United States. So I think that's what we are observing.
We also saw a lot of quote-unquote chemistry yesterday in Texas. Do you believe that it will also translate in some economic gains for either side?
Well, I personally think that, this diplomacy is extremely important. It is extremely important. As much in getting changes done in the United States that are favorable to India, but also in getting changes done in India which are favorable to India. I personally think, I believe as a trade economist that we should liberalize our markets. Even unilaterally, we ought to do it. It is in our interest. After all, we didn't grow at 8% or so without opening up of our own markets. We tried with this protectionism for 4 decades. And we produced a growth rate of below 4%, and per capita incomes rose 1.5% only for those 40 years. So I believe that that's good for us. But let's pretend that it's not so good for us, and we are going to make a big sacrifice, and in the process get the United States to give us concessions also. So I think the fact of good chemistry between the two leaders is extremely important. It lifts the spirits on both sides.
Indeed it does. And on that note, I'm going to end this conversation as well, where it was most encouraging to see your optimism as well on slowdown and all the other things that I started with. Thank you so much.